All right. Well, welcome everybody. I am so excited to have you on this show. You are here in the right place. This is Mary Hyatt, and I am hang on a second. There we go. Okay, I had it on my screen. It was giving me feedback there. But so excited to have you on the show. I have a very special guest that I cannot wait to introduce you to. I'm going to get into how amazing she is, and we're going to get into some fabulous content around intuitive eating here in just a minute. But we will let everybody take a second and hop on. And you might want to grab a pen and paper for this one. I think you're going to find there are going to be some juicy nuggets, some really great takeaways that you are going to want to remember for a long time. Hey, Lisa. Hey, Whitney. So glad you guys are here. I know that earlier today, people were commenting on my Instagram and sending me messages on my Insta story, talking about how much they love Christy and how much they are really looking forward to the content today. But maybe this is your first time on the Mary Hyatt Show. Maybe somebody shared this link with you today. So I just want to take a quick moment to introduce myself, just in case you don't know who I am. So like I said, my name is Mary Hyatt. I am a life coach. I am an intuitive eater. I'm a body love advocate. And my just excitement for life is really helping women to wake up, to find their voice, and to become fully alive. And so every week on the Mary Hyatt Show, we look at topics surrounding self-discovery, vulnerability, authenticity. And recently, we've been talking a lot about the body, how we can get to a place of really accepting the body that we have today without the desire or need to want to change it or to lose weight, but really being able to be in a space where we know who we are in our true essence, and we can find peace when we look in the mirror, we can find peace around food, and really get to the place of feeling freedom in our bodies and from this crazy diet culture that we're surrounded by a little bit more every single day. And so in line with that mission that I have brought on a fabulous special guest today. So let me go ahead and just share my screen really quick because I want you to be able to see her face. So Christy Harrison is, oh my gosh, she's amazing. We met last year officially at a event in Nashville that was all about body positivity and intuitive eating called Hot and Healthy Habits Retreat. And Christy was the moderator for many panels during the weekend retreat. And I got to know her a little bit. And I remember thinking, I've got to get Christy on the show. She is a wealth of knowledge. Perhaps you have listened to her podcast, Food Psych. It is a podcast that I feel like is really rare and unique in the land of podcasting because Christy is not afraid to get into some deep topics about weight stigma and fat phobia and what it looks like when politics get involved and how we view ourselves and sort of the role we play as women. And so I hope that you will definitely check that out on iTunes. But Christy is a registered dietitian, nutritionalist, and a certified intuitive eating counselor based in Brooklyn, New York. She offers an online intuitive eating course and a private intuitive eating coaching to help people make peace with food and their bodies. Since 2013, Christy has hosted Food Psych, a podcast exploring people's relationships with food and paths to body positivity. It is now #1 on the iTunes charts for intuitive eating and health at every size, and is one of the top 100 podcasts in the health category. She is strongly committed to the health at every size movement and serves as a member at large on the board of the Association for Size, Diversity, and Health. Christy began her career as a journalist in 2003 and has written for and edited major publications including Gourmet, The Food Network, Refinery29, Slate, BuzzFeed, Modernist Cuisine, All Recipes, and many others. As an expert on nutrition and people's relationships with food, she has been quoted in top media outlets including Refinery29, Health, Men's Fitness, Bon Appetit, The Observer, and more. I've got Christy's links that you can check out on the description of this video, so you can check her out on Instagram, on Twitter, on Facebook. Definitely check out her website. She has a wealth of information there. So let me just stop with this and welcome Christy. I'm so glad that you were on the show today.
Thank you so much, Mary. It's great to be here.
So Christy, I just want to get straight into it because I feel like we could probably talk for hours and we only have a little bit of time. So I really want to utilize that and get into a lot of concerns that people are having around intuitive eating. But I'm curious, before we get into that, how did you get into intuitive eating? Like take me on a little journey of where that began to kind of where you are now.
Yeah. So, I mean, like everybody, I began my life as an intuitive eater, right? Because we're all born knowing how to connect with our hunger and our fullness and our body's cues. And I was sort of fortunate, and, a lot of that was thin privilege to be sort of living in a thin body my whole life. I didn't have anyone telling me I needed to lose weight. I didn't have any diets, pushed upon me. Didn't buy into any of that stuff until I turned 20. And then I went on the birth control pill, gained a little bit of weight, and then, the whole spiral started because being raised in diet culture, like we all know, we're not supposed to gain weight, right? So if we do, it's like this whole cascade of events sort of begins. And so I spiraled into a period of really disordered eating and, an eating disorder that sort of morphed between restriction and binging and overexercise and, all these different kind of facets to it. And that was, my early to mid 20s was kind of lost to that. And, in my mid 20s, I started working in food media. Really early 20s, I started to specialize in food journalism. And then I worked at a food magazine full time in my mid 20s. And that was one thing that sort of started the process of reconnecting my relationship with food and starting to drop some of the restrictions and the dieting. And then I decided to go back to graduate school to become a dietitian. And in that process, I actually discovered the book Intuitive Eating from Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, the sort of seminal text on this, and read the book. And that sort of was like, that along with therapy really was the final stage in my recovery from disordered eating. So it was kind of a winding path and, dovetailed with my career path, really.
It's so fascinating, hearing a little bit of your journey. And as you were talking about disordered eating and sort of what that looked like, all I kept thinking about was how all of the things that you were describing would be what it looks like to be on good behavior as a woman in our society today, trying to lose that weight, trying to, restrict or to binge or, all the different ways that kind of manifests itself. So often that's the prescription that society has given us to kind of fix ourselves. And I was just talking with a woman last night who is in my Babe Redefined course. And we were talking a little bit about intuitive eating. And she goes, I was watching the course and she goes, I realized that I don't have any normal conversations with my girlfriends that aren't centered around diets and losing weight. She goes, I can look at all of my texts and that's all we talk about. And it's kind of like, that's the good behavior that we've been taught, is to always be on a diet, to always be trying to lose the weight, whether that's the last 5 pounds or 80 pounds. And so, just kind of what a gift that you were able to have the introduction to intuitive eating to kind of, work backwards to get yourself out of the crazy, that we've all been taught. Obviously, you teach this, you have an incredible course on intuitive eating that goes into the depth of what this really looks like, how it manifests itself in our life. But can you kind of give a quick synopsis maybe of what intuitive eating is for those people watching who maybe don't know exactly the ins and outs of it?
Sure. Yeah. So, like I said before, it is the default mode, right? It's how we're all born knowing how to eat. But unfortunately, most of us living in diet culture get disconnected from that at some point, whether that's, in our 20s, like I did, or much younger. And so the intuitive eating that I teach is 10 principles for reconnecting you with that, body wisdom that you were born with. And so the 10 principles are to ditch the diet mentality or reject the diet mentality, which is like the biggest one, the foundation, to learn to honor your hunger, to make peace with food, meaning not have any off limits foods or bad foods that you don't allow yourself to eat, to challenge the food police, which are the sort of rules in your mind that are, constantly chattering at you, telling you what you should and shouldn't eat, respect your fullness and feel your fullness and sort of know what that feels like. Discovering the satisfaction factor, like finding pleasure and satisfaction in food is something that we're so robbed of in diet culture. We're so disconnected from pleasure. So I think that's a huge part of it, is being able to reconnect with that sense of pleasure. Learning ways of coping with your emotions without using food, which, I think emotional eating gets a bad rap because it really is largely, spawned by restriction in the first place. It's like there really would be no emotional eating without some degree of restriction for most people. So learning to, drop the restriction and then also manage your emotions in other ways. Respect your body is the next principle. And that's, respecting your natural size and shape, like you were talking about, not trying to shrink your body to fit society's unrealistic standards, knowing what your body is capable of and what its limitations are and being okay with that. And then gentle nutrition, which is kind of the, most challenging. It's sort of the last principle for a reason, because it really is like the pinnacle of this, sort of new way of thinking about things. So where you've broken down the diet mentality, thoughts, and restrictions around food, and you're able to get to a place where you can see nutrition as just self-care. I always say self-care, not self-control. I was actually noticing I'm using this mug today. It says, nice. Self-care, not self-control. So, it's a way of caring for yourself through food, and not using food as a way to, punish yourself or control yourself, but using nutrition, just gentle nutrition guidelines, as a way to take care of yourself and know, like, hey, this food's going to give me some energy. This is what I need right now, kind of planning your day.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you went over that, because that really is, it's a quick look at it, but it gives a framework on what intuitive eating is. And I think so many of us are caught in this diet mentality that we really want by default to treat intuitive eating like another diet.
Yeah.
Like, here's a set of rules, here's what I can do, here's what I can't do. And so we sort of tend to, I see, approach it that way from the beginning, as another new set of rules, a new set of things that we're supposed to do. And like you were saying, one of the principles is to really get to the place where you make peace with food, that no food is off limits, that there is sort of an equality in a sense to food at the beginning, of rejecting that diet to where you give yourself permission to eat whatever. And one of the common fears that I hear that comes up all the time is really at the base a lack of trust. But it's something like, if I let myself eat anything, then won't I just eat all the bad foods? Like, won't I just eat ice cream all day, every day? So what would you say to somebody who has that fear at the beginning of just like, never been able to eat anything that they wanted to before?
Yeah, I would say it's totally normal. It's totally understandable to have that fear. And diet culture and restriction actually creates that fear, because when you restrict yourself, you're much more likely to binge. You're much more likely to end up overeating the foods that you've, deemed off limits. And so if you've been in a cycle of doing that for a long time, and you've had, say, ice cream always be off limits, then oftentimes it is true that when you give yourself access to it, the access feels temporary and fleeting, and your body and your brain sort of don't trust that it's actually going to be permanent access. It's more like, how can I get as much in as possible before the next diet starts, right? AKA the next famine. Right. And so, you're sort of driven towards those foods, and you're driven towards also like sweeter, higher carbohydrate foods in situations of food scarcity, aka like deprivation, calorie restriction, et cetera. Like, those are the foods that your brain is wired to seek out preferentially, because in ancient times, in evolutionary history, we really needed that, so that we were motivated to seek the foods that would keep us going, that would perpetuate our species. And so we wouldn't be here really without that mechanism in place, but so sort of knowing that, and just having an awareness that that's what happens when you first go back to eating the foods that were off limits. And I call it the honeymoon phase. It's like, there might be a time when all you want to eat is ice cream, right? And you're like, can I really eat ice cream for breakfast, lunch, and dinner? You totally can. You can give yourself permission to do that. At some point, though, you are going to get sick of it. And really the getting sick of it and the wanting more variety, not that you'll never want ice cream again, but just that, like, you might also want a sandwich or a bowl of cereal or whatever. You might also want some more balance in your life. And so getting to that point of feeling like, oh, it's just another option, it's food I can have any old time, really takes sort of consistently giving yourself permission to eat it. And again, breaking down around that diet mentality, going back to that first principle and like, you know, chipping away at those restrictions and those voices in your head that are saying you're not supposed to eat this.
Yeah, you know, it's so funny. I had kind of an intuitive eating like graduation moment the other day. I had a dear friend who had a birthday in January, and then we didn't see each other for Christmas. And so she came over and she brought me this amazing box of Belgian chocolates, which are some of my favorite kinds of chocolates. And so I ate one, and then the next day I ate one, and the box is sitting on my countertop in the kitchen. And I went by the other day, I was like, oh my God, like there's still chocolate left in that box. Mm-hmm. And I had this moment where, you know, before I learned intuitive eating, I would have literally eaten that entire box of chocolate that day in fear that, you know, I needed to kind of get it all done in one moment so that I could have all the guilt at one time and didn't prolong the feelings of shame. And then I could hurry up and get over it and then, you know, do my penance and, do my workouts or whatever I needed to do to make up for what I had done because I was in bad behavior. Where now it's like when you make peace with food and you know it's always there, you know it's always available. Like I can, even if I were to eat that box of chocolate all the way to the end, I could go out and buy some more of that chocolate if I wanted to. And that there's never, like you said, that scarcity of this is the only time I can have it because that next diet is always around the corner, always kind of in the back of my mind. And that really is, I think, such a powerful place to get to where food doesn't feel so charged, where it's just, you eat it if you want it, you can leave it, you can come back to it, you can get more if you need to.
Shoot.
If I actually stop dieting.
Oh, sorry, I just froze for a second.
That's okay. So somebody asked, if I actually stop dieting, won't I just gain even more weight and lose all self-control?
Yes. So, you know, for the self-control piece, I would say going back to that idea of self-care, not self-control, right? Really the way that we govern ourselves in intuitive eating. And I would argue that, you know, is the better way to govern ourselves through life is self-care, right? And care for yourself means, you know, doing things that make you feel good, not doing things that make you feel bad, not doing things that make other people feel bad, right? Having empathy and, you know, sort of allowing that, you know, compassion for yourself and others, right? So I think, you know, self-care, there's an argument to be made that self-care is a better way to approach everything in life than self-control. And what I just said about the honeymoon phase, you know, it might be true that you do feel out of control with particular foods at first, but when you give yourself consistent permission, it really does dissipate. And eventually you will be able to have that like box of chocolate sitting there. Or like, you know, I have those foods too, where it's like, I never thought I'd be able to have that in my pantry for more than a day. Right. And now they sit there for weeks or months or whatever, you know? So it really is possible. To the question of gaining weight, that's a, you know, sort of complicated thing to untangle because basically in our culture, which is diet culture, which privileges thin bodies and, you know, demotes larger bodies, basically, you know, it's inculcated in us from birth to, you know, have that hierarchy of bodies, right? And that's really the diet mentality. That's the way that diet culture is showing up in all of our minds. And so, you know, we have to undo this idea, this equation of, you know, higher weight with lower worth. We have to stop, you know, trying to lose weight because honestly, like there is no way to have a balanced relationship with food, you know, peaceful relationship with food if you're trying to lose weight or maintain your weight or manipulate your weight in any way. Like if you're putting that, I always say that's putting the cart before the horse, you know, like your weight's going to settle where it will, wherever is healthy for you, for your particular body, when you're doing self-care behaviors, you know, when you're practicing those to the best of your abilities, to the best of your circumstances. Obviously, you know, some folks don't have economic access to certain forms of self-care and stuff like that. But whatever you can do, you know, whatever your circumstances allow for you to care for yourself, when you're doing that, eventually your body weight's going to stabilize and it's just going to be what it is. And having it stabilize even at a higher weight, even at what would be, you know, considered overweight or obese in our body mass index standards, which like, don't even get me started on that because body mass index is total BS too.
Yeah.
You know, even if you're stabilized at a higher weight on those charts, you're actually in better health and you're better off, you know, you're at lower risk of chronic diseases and stuff than you would be if you were constantly fighting your body, constantly dieting and engaging in disordered behaviors. And ultimately, usually that pushes people's weight up over time anyway. So there's, sort of a phenomenon where people lose weight for a short period of time, end up regaining the weight, and, up to 2/3 of people regain more weight than they lost. So it's like, I always say, like, the easiest way to gain weight is to try to lose weight. Not that gaining weight is bad in and of itself, right? It's, again, weight neutral, weight inclusive. I'm all about, people in larger bodies loving themselves, fat acceptance, all of that. But just to say, like, it's not even going to work for what you think it's going to do,
Totally. Well, and I can attest to that even in my own journey, just feeling like, okay, if I could just get in a thinner body, then surely I'm going to be healthier. It's such a belief that we have, is that thinner people are healthier. People in larger bodies are considered unhealthy, and it's just not the case. I mean, for me, when I'm holding on to a little extra weight, I'm much healthier. I have more energy. I'm sleeping better. I'm getting sick less often. And I just feel, completely different than when I'm in a state of stress or when I'm in a state of restriction or whatever, for whatever reasons, I've, lost weight. And I love that you mentioned the stability piece, because I think what you're talking about is when we are in that season, which, who can relate? I feel like everybody has been in that season where it's like your weight goes up and it goes down, it goes up and it goes down. And just probably what that does, for your body, the stress that causes. And if you can get to that place of being stable at your weight, whether that is in a larger body or a smaller body, it's like everything in your body can relax. It's not in that state of fight or flight or restriction or stress. I can so relate to that. And by the way, I have some of your graduates of your course. We've got Samantha Bilby, and she says, hi, she loves you. And Alyssa Puglia, sorry. And Alyssa said, I totally had that experience once I started having off-limit foods in the house and ate them for a while. I was able to have them in the house and only touch them now and then because I didn't find myself wanting it so bad that I had to eat it all. So yes, I love that. It's so awesome. Okay, here's an interesting question. A lot of people that I know are into this cleansing fad, I'll call it that, right? And so this idea of restricting certain foods for a period of time to cleanse out their body or cleanse out their liver. And I'm just curious, can you eliminate foods, even if it's not in a cleanse, but let's say you view either sugar as bad or dairy as bad or gluten or carbohydrates or fat, can you eliminate certain foods and still be an intuitive eater?
Gosh, what a good question. I would say, first of all, like, cleanses, no good. I don't recommend them. That's not a way to be intuitive. I think cleanses are very much from diet culture. They're within the diet mentality. There's no actual scientific evidence that you need to cleanse. And in fact, your liver and your kidneys and your lungs are all self-cleansing organs. Like, they're not, people think of them as like drain pipes that get all clogged up and need to have like Drano go through them or something. That's the rationale for cleanses. But actually, they're more like wastewater processing plants. Your liver uses chemical reactions to treat waste that comes in that might be toxic to your body, to neutralize it and then, pass it through. So it's not like it does that on its own. You don't have to do anything to facilitate that, unless you have, cirrhosis or, alcoholism and things like that are making your liver not function. It's going to do that just fine.
Well, and I see too with cleanses, what happens is, because it is that diet mentality, it's almost, couldn't be more identical to a diet. And then in that, you restrict for a short amount of time, you start feeling really good. It's that kind of honeymoon phase of feeling really, really great. And then the minute that cleanse is over, that restriction if you get to the end, that's, kind of a miracle, in and of itself. But if you do get to the end, let's say like, what's the Whole30, for example, or something like that, then you go and binge right after. You go right back into your kind of old ways of being, if not even more so into that line of just eating whatever you can find around you because you've been in such deprivation. But the argument that I see happening all the time is like, but we're eating healthy foods. We're eating these whole foods. We're eating fresh vegetables, and we're eating, whole grains, and we're eliminating, all the bad foods. And so, and that kind of goes back to the question, can you eliminate certain food groups and still eat intuitively?
Yeah, so that's the great second part of the question that we definitely have to address, because really, like, there's so many myths out there that, gluten is bad for you, dairy is bad for you, sugar, like all of these are myths. All of these are perpetuated by diet culture. They don't have any scientific validity to them. People for millennia around the world have been eating all of these different food groups with no consequences, no ill effect, right? So there's, these sort of pockets in modern diet culture. And this is something that I'm working on a larger writing project that I can announce pretty soon. But, looking into the history of diet culture and how it's really shape-shifted and gone underground in the new millennium, so that now we don't have as many, weight loss diets and stuff being touted as such. It's more like wellness diets, and you'll be healthier if you follow the Whole30, or if you do this, paleo, low carb, whatever stuff, right? And it's, billed as a lifestyle, not a diet. But actually these things are all still diets. They're all still restrictive, and in that mindset way too, like you said, they're setting you up for a binge. They're setting you up to, overeat, or, not overeat in the sense that, it's bad, but sort of this feeling of binging, or this feeling of discomfort, or just like really going to town on particular foods that were restricted when you were, following the diet. And so there's no scientific evidence that, the general population needs to eliminate gluten or dairy or carbs, or I forget what the other things you said were, but like, there's no scientific evidence supporting that in the general population. I will say, for people with celiac disease, for example, which is a medically diagnosed condition that, you need to go to a medical doctor to get that diagnosis. You don't have it if you don't have the diagnosis, but if you have celiac disease, then your body has a gene that can't actually process gluten. And so it makes gluten harmful to you. And so in that case, yes, you can definitely eliminate gluten from your diet and follow, a gluten-free, diet in the sense of habitual eating pattern. Not a restrictive diet, but like be gluten-free and be an intuitive eater. And that goes back to the self-care thing that I'm talking about, if you have celiac disease, or if you have a peanut allergy or a nut allergy, or whatever, any kind of genuine medically diagnosed, situation where you need to cut out a particular food because it's harmful to you, you can absolutely do that from a place of self-care and also really enjoy your food still, and be an intuitive eater.
Yeah. And, I think about from my own life, and I don't eat a lot of gluten because I feel like my body has this threshold where, it's definitely not off limits. I eat it today. I eat it when, that there's something I want, I eat it. But I have noticed in my own body that there's this threshold. If I eat it, I don't know, maybe several times during the day for several days in a row, I haven't quite figured out exactly the correct thing for my body, but there's a point where my joints start to hurt. I get a little bit inflamed, and say, okay, let me just kind of gently, back this down. And then, kind of it's almost like an intuitive process of trusting my own body's wisdom, like getting to the place where I go, okay, what gives me energy? What makes me feel my best? What allows for me to sleep well and to feel like I have, sharp cognitive functioning? And I tell my clients all the time, and they laugh at me. I'm like, y'all, I eat nachos probably 3 or 4 times a week, and I love nachos, and then I also might have a green juice, or I may have, we have this amazing pizza place near my house that I'll go get a slice of pizza when I feel like it, and so it's coming out of a place of really, I think, learning how to trust your body's innate wisdom, and your body's going to tell you if those certain foods make you feel good or not. And I think we have the classic offenders like gluten and sugar and dairy and all those things, but it could be as simple as, man, every time I eat bananas, my stomach starts to hurt, or gosh, every time for a while, I ate so many strawberries that my skin would break out on my arms, which was like so bizarre. So it could even be some of those good foods that we think of as good foods that can cause a reaction in our bodies. And so I think the intuitive eating piece of this is not vilifying any one particular food group, but really going, okay, I am the, highest counsel on my own body. And so what is the feedback that I'm receiving from what I'm putting in my body? And, adjusting from that place rather than all gluten is bad and all sugar is bad and I can't have any of that, barring the fact that you don't have, diagnosable disorder there. And Charlene, I love my audience because they're going to come at us and they're going to give us some good feedback. Charlene said, sorry, but that's not true across the board. My immediate symptoms when eating dairy or gluten contradict that. So how do you approach that for people who maybe have psoriasis or eczema or things like that, and they eliminate something like gluten or dairy and their symptoms go away? Is it kind of what we're already talking about, or would you give a different explanation to that?
Yeah. So, there's lots of things that go into this, right? So, there's definitely things like lactose intolerance or wheat allergy that's not a gluten sensitivity, that's not celiac disease. Like wheat allergy is a different thing, that you could also get tested and diagnosed for, and that can cause sometimes, skin breakouts or vomiting or diarrhea or stomach aches or something like that. And I think that getting diagnosed and having really solid evidence, and not from, this is like controversial probably in certain wellness circles, but wellness culture really to me is the new guise of diet culture. And the way that certain naturopathic practitioners work. I love certain naturopaths. I think, they can be great, but I think that some naturopathic practitioners, some chiropractors, some acupuncturists, et cetera, will offer these tests, even some dietitians, honestly, will offer these tests that are not scientifically validated, that tell you're allergic to 70 things, right? People sometimes will come in with these long lists where it's like eggs and, mangoes and whatever. It's just like a million different things, right? And that is not objectively true. The way that those tests are done is not scientifically valid, because basically what it just shows is like biomarkers in your blood that you've had exposure to those foods, which is not the same thing as being allergic to those foods, right? Yeah. And I do think that there's value in knowing your own body and being able to say, like, for example, I have acid reflux and I know that I can't have caffeine with it because it really aggravates it and makes me feel terrible. And that was something that I learned over a long period of time of trial and error. But I will say that from that experience, and also just, working with clients on this stuff for a long time, like the later stage of intuitive eating with gentle nutrition, that stuff becomes possible, where you're like able to tune into your body and say what works or what doesn't. But there's a long period before you get into the gentle nutrition phase of intuitive eating, where you have to be working on breaking down the diet mentality, challenging all those rules that you've put on yourself, the things that you've absorbed from the culture about gluten being bad or dairy being the devil or whatever, and challenge those thoughts and really push back against them so that you can actually neutralize them and not be, because I've seen people impose these things on themselves because they think something's bad from the diet mentality, from diet culture. They've been told it's bad, so they've internalized this idea that it's bad. And there's some psychosomatic situations where you can actually make yourself feel bad because you're so anxious about eating the food. That's not the case for everybody who has any reactions like that, but I would just say, I would invite anyone out there who has those thoughts, like the person who asked this question, to consider, could you be so anxious about those foods that it's potentially causing some of the symptoms you're experiencing? Also, could it be in the context of overall disordered eating, where you're not eating enough and then you're having a restrict binge cycle, you're under eating in general, or you're binging in general, or you're, which can cause constipation and bloating and diarrhea and stomach aches and, things that too often now in this new guise of diet culture get blamed on particular foods. And it's like, oh, you must be sensitive to this food. Actually, maybe you're just restricting and binging, and that's what's causing all these symptoms you're experiencing. So I would say go through all those potential reasons first, and also try to get a legit medical diagnosis, to see ruling out some of these things, and then come around to the gentle nutrition place and say, okay, does this really honestly make me feel bad, or am I layering it with all these ideas from diet culture which don't need to be here?
Yeah, and I feel like one of the ways to know if it is somehow related to diet culture, again, one of those food rules, is the fact that there's guilt or shame involved. And anytime to me that you feel guilt or shame around food, then you can be very sure that you're probably still stuck in that diet mentality, those food rules, good and bad mentality with what you're eating, versus just tapping into the intuition of your body. Because when you're really intuitively listening, there is no guilt, there is no shame. I mean, you really can honor and trust your body in such a profoundly deep way that those two emotions, guilt and shame, aren't present because you have the freedom around it. And so I think that's always kind of a good indicator for me when I'm like, oh, I shouldn't be eating gluten today. And I'm like, is it because my body's telling me that there's some sort of a symptom, or is that diet culture saying, oh, remember gluten's bad, so you better start restricting again, kind of getting that guilt thing going on, the shame thing going on. And that's a good little internal barometer for me to see, okay, where am I at really? Is this a real clear channel here, or is this being informed by that old diet culture junk?
That's great.
Okay, so I kind of want to switch into another topic that comes up so often when we're looking at intuitive eating and just our bodies. We talked about kind of the idea of wanting to lose weight earlier. And one of the arguments, I think, against this method of intuitive eating is, well, what about obesity? What about obesity? People in obese bodies are, what we've been told is it's an epidemic. It's, now we're seeing obesity in children. It's sort of the highlight of American culture, and we're more at risk for disease, diabetes. And so what do you say in regards to this epidemic of obesity that we're really, really afraid of in our culture?
Oh my God, so many thoughts. So the first thing is just a note on language. Like, I don't like the word obesity. It's very stigmatizing and it's pathologizing people in larger bodies, but really there is body diversity naturally occurring in the world. The BMI chart is a bell curve, right? And it was actually, point of history, it was actually developed as a statistical tool, like just to measure like what's the distribution of bodies in the population. It was done by a statistician just as like a mathematical exercise. It was not applied to people or their health until much later, when insurance companies got a hold of it and started looking at, is there any correlation between people being at a certain body size on this chart and, life insurance policies needing to pay out higher amounts, basically. And, interestingly, the people who could afford life insurance policies back then, because it was like the 1800s, or maybe early 1900s, I forget, but the people who were buying life insurance policies then were like older, rich, white men, right? Like people who probably had a lot of access to food, maybe were in larger bodies because they had more access to food, whereas, the typical person did not have as much access to food. And so, these were like, it was a skewed sample basically of people who were, not only had a lot of access to food, but also a lot of access to like drink and alcohol and sort of bon vivant lifestyle, and, were maybe under higher stress or whatever. There's like, sort of, it was not a legit statistical correlation. It was just like, this is a small population that we're seeing this correlation in between higher risk of mortality or something and higher body weight. Subsequently, that has been debunked in very large scale studies showing that actually people in the so-called overweight body mass index category live longer than anyone else. And people in the so-called normal and the so-called obese categories have about the same risk of mortality. And the highest risk of mortality is actually in the underweight category. And so, that's been repeated multiple times in like thousands of people. And so, there's also this thing with weight stigma, which I think is a really important piece to bring in here, because, in statistics and public health, correlation does not equal causation, which means, if you see a correlation in the data between, say, higher weight and higher risk of diabetes, let's say, all we know is that they're correlated, that they're associated with one another. We don't know what the direction of that correlation is, whether one causes the other or the other causes the one, or there's some third factor that's here causing both of them. It just tells us the association. Because of our fat phobic society, because we live in a culture that has come to demonize fat, and the weight loss industry is like a huge, $67 billion operation at this point. There's so much force in our culture pushing us to interpret those correlations as, oh, clearly the fat is causing the health problems. And in fact, there's a third factor that's present that has been now shown to be associated with higher risk of chronic disease in people in larger bodies, which is weight stigma. which is sort of stemming from, that's like the overarching thing in our culture, right? Is stigmatizing people in larger bodies, telling people they need to lose weight, telling them that their bodies are bad or wrong, shaming experiences by, peers, parents, doctors. People in larger bodies are also less likely to get hired for jobs and, more likely to struggle in poverty and things like that. So there's all sorts of associations between being in a larger body and having these stigmatizing situations that then can cause the conditions for poor health outcomes. And in the case of diabetes in particular too, there's also some evidence that like type 2 diabetes, one of the symptoms of it is weight gain. And so it's not, Linda Bacon, who's a great writer and researcher in this field, has said, it's kind of like saying that having yellow teeth causes lung cancer, because people with yellow teeth tend to develop lung cancer more than people without yellow teeth. But there's a third factor that we're not looking at here, which is smoking, right? People who smoke tend to develop yellow teeth because of the smoking, and also tend to develop lung cancer because smoke causes lung cancer. And it has nothing to do with the yellow teeth causing the cancer, right? So that's the same sort of concept here with weight stigma, is that, we haven't looked enough at the fact that weight stigma can be causing these diseases, and that weight stigma is, of course, associated with being in a larger body in our society. And so that's causing both, it's associated with both of these things, but it's not that the weight itself is causing the disease.
Well, and I love that you're bringing light to this, because we're only seeing one thing. And to me, what you see on billboards, what you see in magazines, anytime you see the word obesity, it's usually linked to some kind of a political propaganda. It's usually linked to some kind of a product solution for it, doctor recommendation. There's a reason. It's like there's a motivation for the scare. There's a motivation for the fear surrounding this epidemic, and it's to lead you somewhere, to lead you to the solution, to lead you to the product, to lead you to the person, to the medication, to whatever, to sell something essentially. And one of the best ways to do that, as we know throughout history, is inducing fear. And I love what you're talking about with, get clear on the research, like start really investigating for yourself and seeing these studies that have been done that disprove what's being shown out there in the public eye, and start seeing that a little more critically and challenging it and asking, like, is that really true? If you kind of give yourself permission to question all of those different pieces of studies that are coming out, was it really the full study? Did they take one element from that study and try to prove something in reality? Like, I feel like that happens all the time, with these studies. They take one element out that wasn't even the point of the study to prove a point. It's like, actually, if you looked at all of the research, it disproves what you're trying to say. So that would be my encouragement, is to start getting really critical about what you're consuming and what you're seeing, and taking it as truth when usually it's not. I mean, would you agree with that?
Oh my God, absolutely. And having started my career as a journalist covering food and nutrition and health, I will say, like, journalists in this field are not trained on how to read a study. I now have a master's in public health. That was, I went back to school and got that after starting my career as a journalist, and now actually understand how to read a scientific study. But when I was covering health and science and food, initially, I didn't understand any of that. I would look at, the press releases that the university sent out about a particular study and write the article from the press release and maybe double check some facts in the study. And that's what most journalists in this field do. It's rare health journalists that's actually looking at the full body of research, or even the full study, to look at what the conclusions are that are being made in the study and what those can be, extrapolated to. I wrote a piece on my blog about this study that supposedly debunked the idea that you can be fat and fit. There's a lot of evidence that you can be fat and fit, but there was this one study that was like, touted in the media, not even the study itself, but the media touted it as, well, this study disproves the fat but fit theory or whatever. And I looked at what the actual study was saying, and it was completely different than what the journalists were interpreting it as, So when you see these headlines in the media, they're really cherry picked. They're really just like interpreting based on, usually the person writing the story's bias. And living in diet culture, we all have an anti-fat bias. And so that's such an easy thing for, stories to get interpreted through. But if you really look at an individual study, like read the entire scientific study, which can be kind of a snooze fest, but, you know, is quite enlightening in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And then you look at the entire body of research, it paints a very different picture.
Well, and I love that. And I mean, even just to that point, I mean, having been a person in a much larger body than I'm currently in right now and teaching plus size yoga classes for several years, I can, you know, very, very much attest to the fact that you can absolutely be fat and fit and feel amazing and feel energetic and all those different elements. That I was in that body that I had then and now in the body that I have now. And yeah, I get like really... I get all turned up when I hear those things. I'm like, really?
Yeah, it's awful.
Okay, so before, to kind of end, I have a couple questions before I did a quick Facebook Live on my page and asked if anybody had any questions that they wanted to ask you. So I have a couple that we can just answer quickly. So from Jessie, if you are watching, thank you so much for submitting your question. And Jessie asks, so when listening to your body, I've heard that some of the time it may not be that you were actually hungry, but it could be thirst. What are some tips to be able to tell the difference?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I will say, like, you know, there's a couple layers to that question. The first layer is like, where is that question coming from? You know, investigate the diet mentality that might be showing up in that question, right? Because we fear hunger, we fear thinking that something is hunger when it's not, and eating in the absence of hunger because of diet mentality, because of diet culture and what it's taught us about hunger and about bodies. And so I think, you know, trying to dissociate some of that stuff and, you know, get it to a place where hunger really is morally neutral and not something you need to fear, I think is really important. You know, in terms of the difference between hunger and thirst, I think there's some kind of basic self-care principles that you can think about, you know, like with, again, this gentle nutrition piece of self-care, not self-control, knowing that the human body really fluctuates in energy every like 3 to 4 hours. And so, you know, if you've gone a few hours without eating and you're, you know, say it's between lunch and dinner or between meals or between a snack and a meal, and you're starting to have that feeling, it's a good bet, you know, if it's been a few hours, that there's some hunger present. There might also be some thirst present. You know, sometimes hunger and thirst happen at the same time, right? And so I think if you feel like it might be thirst, you know, you can notice like your mouth is dry, or you're starting to feel maybe a little lightheaded at the sort of later stages of thirst. You know, you can try having some water and see if that helps. But I would say there's, you know, definitely sort of a risk within diet culture, because there's so many messages out there that, like, you know, diet tips of like, drink a glass of water if you think you're hungry, fool your body into thinking it's full and into thinking it's full. And, you know, that's not the point here. Like, we actually don't want to do stuff like that. So, right. You know, I think if you're sort of having this confusion around like, am I hungry or am I thirsty, as a way to like disconnect from that diet mentality and not let yourself do those disordered things, I would say try having a snack and a glass of water, you know? Yeah. See if that helps, right? Or if one of those things is really sounding better to you in the moment than the other, then you kind of have your answer. You know, if it's like, okay, I could have, you know, some whatever snack, or do I want like some tea or some water or whatever, you might, you know, find that something is naturally calling to you a little more. Of course, that's easier in the later stages of intuitive eating. And I think in the early stages of intuitive eating, it's really beneficial just to like make sure that you're eating regularly, so that you're not going long stretches without eating and getting yourself set up for then, you know, either painful kind of severe restriction or overeating and rebound binging and stuff.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, great question. Great answer. I had another question, and I don't know what happened to it. I couldn't find it. So it may have gotten deleted because we may have already answered it. So Christy, I just want to thank you for spending your afternoon with us and answering all these amazing questions and having a real like honest discussion that I think is probably a very controversial point of view in how we view food and how we view our bodies and diet culture. And so just thank you for your voice and your bravery for being willing to speak up against this, because I know for me, I mean, just listening to your podcast has been like so reassuring when I start doubting the intuitive eating process, or I start getting in my head, or all my friends are starting the Whole30 or they're doing this cleanse. It's like, can I really trust myself, you know, in this intuitive eating and the work that I do around body positivity as well. Just, you've been such an incredible resource. And we just need more voices like yours. And so thank you for sharing yours over and over again and being so generous with your knowledge. And I want to make sure that people know where to find you. So is there anything that you have coming up that you want people to know about, or where would be the best place for people to continue to support your mission and follow you?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's such a joy to talk with you, and you have such a great way of, leading a show like this. So I just love
thanks.
it. And yeah, people can find me at my podcast, which is Food Psych. Like you said, it's available on iTunes. It's also available on Stitcher and Google Play Music and iHeartRadio and all the apps basically. And you can also get my free guide, which is like an intuitive eating quick start guide called 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food, which is at christyharrison.com/strategies.
Awesome. And we have the links to that in the comments. So definitely check that out. As this goes up online, we'll also have all of these links in the show notes. But please follow Christy, y'all. She's a badass. I mean, she gets into it, and I just love it. I love your ability to just tell the truth and to call out the things that you see that are injustices in the world and how we view our bodies, and not only for women, but for men as well. I know you've had men on your show, and this is now something that's very prevalent in the lives of men, with weight stigma and all of that too. So your husband, your boyfriend, your friends, whoever your partners would really enjoy Christy's info as well. So thank you again for being on this show, and thank you everyone for watching and for being present and asking your questions and being willing to spar back and forth with us a little bit. We absolutely love that. And I will be on next week with another very special guest. So stay tuned for that announcement. And for now, I hope you guys have a beautiful rest of your week. And if you haven't also checked out the book Intuitive Eating, I highly recommend that you go on Amazon, grab it. Neither one of us gets any money from that. It really is life-changing. And that would be a really beautiful first step to get going on this journey. All right. Thanks, Christy.
Thanks, Mary.
All righty. Bye.